Good evening, everybody. My name is Idil Abdillahi, and my pronouns are she, her, and I am a faculty member in the School of Disability Studies, and I bring greetings for you from my fellow DST members. On the screen, you will see that I'm a Black woman wearing a green and black scarf, black rimmed glasses, a bald head, a black dress, and a gold necklace with my name on it. It is my pleasure to be here with you today and to welcome you to our third panel of this series in a panel of 5 discussions in the Black Oculars Speakers Series. I will begin with a land acknowledgement as we gather here today to listen to the speakers share their thinking, reflect, and learn from their perspectives. And to engage in critical discussion, we acknowledge that the School of Disability Studies is on Treaty 13 territory, a treaty that is established between the Mississauga of the Credit River and the British Crown. We are surrounded by Treaty 13A, Treaty 20, also known as the Williams Treaty, and Treaty 19. I speak to you today from the city that is currently called Takaranto or Toronto. And the university, which is in the Dish with One Spoon territory, which is a territory between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabeg, including allied nations, to be peacefully shared and protect the resources around the Great Lakes. As always, the purpose of a land acknowledgement is to help us pause and recognize territory and recognize the territories that we are on, and also to find ourselves somewhere. And if you find yourself somewhere else other than Toronto right now, I hope that you are able to acknowledge where you are and to acknowledge both the history and presence of Indigenous communities in the place where you call home. While those of us who are not Indigenous to this territory have arrived as settlers on Indigenous territories in different ways, we acknowledge that some of our ancestors and elders were forcibly displaced and brought here involuntarily or by force, particularly those brought here as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. We acknowledge that we are all treaty people and we are grateful to be working and living on this land. The School of Disability Studies is an undergraduate degree completion program with a robust record of postdoctoral studies. The school has a strong commitment to equity and justice for disability, MAD, and deaf people, but is always oriented to affirm the desirability that troubles disability, madness, and deafhood among us all. Together, we begin with our bodies and our minds to critically reflect on the impact of surveillance, containment, public resistance, and many other themes that will be discussed in this series. This panel focuses on the experiences of Black women and non-binary people at the intersection of emerging trends in artificial intelligence, specifically taking up issues in facial recognition algorithms, individually targeted health and risk-based AI, decreasing privacy and potential technological backlash among women and non-binary people. This panel specifically looks at these impacts on the lives of Afro-Indigenous, Black women and non-binary people. The work comes to us today by way of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the Connections Grant, and it builds on a growing body of work that is interrogating social policy, institutions, and anti-Black state violence. It is further informed by some of my previous work in the areas of surveillance, the experiences of Black women, poverty and state violence, madness, medicalization, and broader Black life and livabilities. These discussions provide a platform for critical reflection and dialogue amongst students, academics, activists, and artists, bringing diverse perspectives and experiences to bear on the topic. A few notes on access. This evening, we don't have any deaf interpretation, i.e. one of our interpreters had to cancel last minute. And so the interpretation team has made a decision not to go forward this evening. And so we apologize for that. However, we do have access to live captioning. And so if you require live captioning, kindly click on the CC button at the bottom of the screen. There are a few ways for you to participate in tonight's panel. The chat box will be kept off for participants for the series. However, we encourage attendees to ask questions and ask questions in using the Zoom question and answer feature. The use of this feature, to use this feature, please press the Q&A button, type your question into the Q&A box and click send. You can also send us your questions anonymously by clicking the box below in the typing area. We can reply to these questions live or in text with the window. If in the Q&A portion of the panel, you would like to ask a question using audio, please press the raise hand button and we will enable your microphone at the appropriate time. If you need your video on, please feel free to indicate that to us in the Q&A box and we will turn it on at the appropriate time. In addition, if you'd like to use social media to engage in today's panel, please feel free to tag us at Black Oculars on Twitter and Instagram. We are lucky to have Apollo with us this evening and Amber, who will be live tweeting the panel from @Black Oculars on the Twitter account. To introduce this evening's moderator, we are lucky and really grateful to have Jackie with us. Jackie is a second-year PhD student in experimental medicine at McGill University. Studying the use of AI to predict the presence of and treatment responses in brain metastasis in patients with cancer. She's held multiple research positions, including research nursing and project management in nonprofit and pharmaceutical industries, and is interested in the application of AI within her community. Jackie also has a 3-year-old son. So let's go ahead and welcome Jackie, who will be our moderator this evening. Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you so much. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to introduce all 3 of the speakers that are going to be talking today. I'll also give a little bit of some of the questions that were meant to spark the presentations and the talks that we're going to have moving forward. If you have questions, like Idil had mentioned, just put them in the Q&A and we can go through them depending on how the speakers feel at the beginning or in the middle or at the end of their talks. So first, I'm going to introduce Dr. Opara. Dr. Opara is an internationally recognized internal medicine and pediatric primary care physician at Wayne Health, assistant professor at Wayne State University School of Medicine, and associate program director of the Wayne State University School of Medicine Internal Medicine Residency in Detroit, Michigan. Born in Nigeria and baked in Detroit, she is also a global public health expert, international speaker and consultant, scholar, and activist. She equips leaders, communities, organizations, and institutions with systems-based problem-solving tools for achieving their mission and meeting their bottom line while creating equitable, just, anti-racist, and decolonized training and working environments. She's an award-winning medical and community educator, mentor, and leader in both academic and non-academic spheres, and sits on multiple national and international boards and committees addressing anti-racism, decolonization, health equity, and health justice. A liberation medicine practitioner, she centers Black and Indigenous African solutions in her asset-based justice equity work as a National Institutes of Health funded, community-based, participatory translational researcher, organizer, and clinician. She has created and led various health justice initiatives and has transformed the culture of her institution's medical education and faculty development programs through the initiatives she leads and co-leads, respectively, including Health Equity and Justice in Medicine and Global Urban Health Equity programs. She is celebrated for her masterful communication, moderation, and facilitation skills, especially when engaging in challenging conversations regarding racial justice and systems transformation, as demonstrated in her roles as co-chair of the Canada-US Coalition to End Race Correction in Healthcare, co-editor of Racism and Health of PLOS One Global Public Health Journal, creator of Anti-Racism in Medicine Action Roundtable, facilitator of the Governor of Michigan's Roundtable on Reproductive Justice, and member of the White House Office of Public Engagement Health Equity Leaders Roundtable. In appreciation for her dedication to health justice, Dr. Opara was recently recognized by the WSU Board of Governors for her tireless work during the COVID-19 pandemic to raise awareness about medical and scientific racism, create new systems of training for healthcare professionals, advocate for practice and policy changes, as well as institutional accountability, create advocacy networks of Black professionals, and centering the voices and stories of Black patients. I'm so excited to hear what you're going to have to say for us today. I'll go ahead and I'll introduce the next speaker, who is Dr. LLana James. LLana James is a public intellectual and scientist. Her career spans the private sector and public service. She examines how AI disrupts the practice of healthcare and medicine, while it increasingly redefines the human, rehabilitation sciences, public health, and healthcare systems. LLana develops, implements, and evaluates interventions at the intersection of race, ethnicity, medicine, public health, health systems, data, AI, and the law. She is the AI, Medicine, and Data Justice Postdoctoral Fellow at Queen's University. And finally, I will introduce Dr. Idil Abdillahi, who was the person that we first saw on the screen. Dr. Abdillahi is published widely on an array of topics, including mental health, poverty, HIV/AIDS, organizational development, and several other key policy areas at the intersection of Black life and state interruption. Most notably, her cutting-edge research on scholarship on Blackened and anti-Black Satanisms has informed the current debates on fatal police shootings of Black MAD-identified peoples. Her work is attentive to the tensions between data, research, communities, institutions, and monetization, and she strives to challenge the ways that research data about communities experiencing structural oppression, particularly Black communities, is increasingly used in capital-oriented institutions as it simultaneously is serving socio-political care spaces, such as nonprofit organizations, prisons, hospitals, and community-based health centers. Dr. Abdillahi's work integrates an understanding of how these institutions and care spaces continue to disproportionately impact Black women and people, leading to their disenfranchisement from public services and supports in Toronto and beyond. Her newest book, called Black Women Under State, Surveillance, Poverty, and the Violence of Social Assistance from ARP Books, is currently available for sale at your local bookstore. And finally, I'm just going to set the stage a little bit for the discussion coming up, talk about 3 questions that were meant to kind of provoke this conversation. So the first was, can you provide a bit of historical content about the use of health-related technologies and algorithms? This can include both diagnoses and treatments at the intersection of Blackness and womanhood/transness. What are some key contentions that you can describe and anti-Black considerations that must be tended to in the increasing field of race medicine and artificial intelligence more broadly? And finally, what responses can Black feminists share with people working at the intersection of race-based data, technology, and virtual health provision at this time? So I'll pass it over to Dr. Opara for our first talk.
Thank you so much, Jackie. That was such a kind and generous introduction, and I'm really honored to be here. Thank you to everyone that is here present. I'm so excited to share space with my wonderful, powerful sisters, Dr. Idil and LLana, who is my better half, I would like to say. And so with that, again, my name is Dr. Ijeoma Nodim Opara, pronounced she, her, and all. I'm the first daughter of Mrs. Ngozi Nodim and Dr. Ahami Fula Nodim, and I'm really proud to be in your presence today. I want to acknowledge that the land I'm on is the original homelands of the Anishinaabe, otherwise known as the Three Fires people, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. And there's a commitment to continuing to be a better steward of this land while acknowledging the history of genocide and forced removal from Detroit, Owabi, Yatanong. I also acknowledge my ancestors and and community of origin and adoption, the Igbo, African, and diaspora ancestors that lived, resisted, prospered, and sacrificed so that I may be before you standing or sitting in this moment a free Black African woman. I want to name that I am a brown skin colored goddess, honey, and I'm wearing glasses. I have a short curly fade, purple lipstick, black shirt with gold jewelry, my ears and neck, and I have my African print jacket on. If you don't take anything away from today's conversation, I hope that you take and internalize 5 keys. One is that race is a socio-political cultural construct and not a biological category. Secondly, that race is not the same thing as genetic ancestry. Thirdly, that racism is the vector of disease, not quote unquote race. Fourthly, and this might actually be fifthly, you know, because I didn't go to school for math, so I can't count. But that race correction is a racist practice and is tantamount to malpractice. Okay, and these are the 5 keys I want us to keep in mind as I engage in this conversation, and hopefully that this conversation reflects some responses to the questions that were posed. So first of all, just as level set, what is race correction? And so this is, you know, from the work that Lana and I and a wonderful team of amazing brothers and sisters and siblings do, the Canada-US Coalition to End Race Correction in Healthcare. This is a practice that occurs when healthcare providers use a patient's quote-unquote race or racial category to calculate lab results or use quote race-based diagnostic charts or calculators or cutoff ranges to decide whether or not usually a Black person should receive care or decide whether or not the symptoms that Black person is presenting with require treatment. Okay, and the question is, why has this practice remained part of the medical calibrations ever since the slavery, ever since the transatlantic slavery, regardless of the seismic changes and updates in medical knowledge, technology, and ethics? I mean, we've had this amazing landmark work, which is the Human Genome Project, that shows that we are essentially 99.9% identical, you know, as humans, which shows that there is greater genetic variation within each specific racial category than between so-called racialized categories, right? And yet and still, in medicine and in healthcare, we still treat race, quote, as a biological category. We still correct for biological or physiologic processes in the bodies of Black people to meet a certain standard, which is that occurs in white bodies, right? And this is great, a wonderful book by Dr. Joseph Graves, Racism Not Race, Answers to Frequently Asked Questions. This is a powerful brother who was the first African-American that was trained and got his PhD in evolutionary biology and really began to break down much of the internalized beliefs that many people have about the human family, where the invention of human biological race came from and has been used as a reason to explain disparities of health among racialized groups in order to obscure the true cause, which is a white supremacy and structural racism. And we'll talk about that in a second. The work by the outstanding Dr. Dorothy Roberts in her book Fatal Invention. Okay, so y'all will need to know something. I'm a working mom, and this is one of them. And so please give me a second. I need you to please give me please.
Mommy.
Yes.
What?
Chimamanda, please.
My books what I made.
Chimamanda, please.
No, mommy.
Okay.
My books that I made at school yesterday, are going to crumble it.
I'm sorry. Okay, tell them not to do that. And I'm really sorry. Okay, go tell Daddy and close the door. Thank you. All right, thank you very much. This is called work-life integration, baby. There's no such thing as balance. just so you know, we just integrate and we just go with the flow. That's what we do. All right, because I'm a physician mama, and that's how it's always gonna be. So the work of Dr. Dorothy Roberts, who is a fantastic woman, and you want to read this book. It's called Fatal Invention: How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century. Is an outstanding work. It's outstanding work. And this is a quote that really highlights a lot of the thinking when we talk about race correction, and we'll talk about how it integrates into algorithms in a second. But the delusion that race is a biological inheritance rather than a political relationship leads plenty of supposedly intelligent people to make the most ludicrous statements about Black folks and biological traits. But where does that delusion come from? Well, you have quite a few people to thank for this, but there are four of these folks. Will include Dr. Samuel Cartwright, Dr. Charles Morton, Dr. Charles Darwin, and Carl Linnaeus. And these are four, as you can see, bad boys of the 18th century, honey, who really were critical to determining that no, racial differences were biological and rooted in the body and in the genes and in tissues and in organs, and therefore is therefore a veritable reason for the differences in health outcomes. It's important as we understand this concept of scientific racism, which is the system that underpins race-based medicine and then subsequently so-called race correction, by which research characterizing race as an essential biological variable translates into clinical practice and then leading to inequitable care. And what is the function of this, right? The function ultimately, so establish a racial hierarchy. So you have, Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species, and then there's a subtitle that pretty much harkens to the fact that there is a racial hierarchy that, and so those belief systems that were, those pseudoscientific theories that were proposed was essentially to explain why folks that were Caucasoid or Caucasian, aka white, were superior to every other person, with the quote-unquote Negro at the very bottom. And so that is the service of it ultimately. And so what we need to now internalize is that medicine and healthcare is not standalone, immune to racial inequities and somehow just dealing with the gosh darn it poor bad consequences of all this societal inequities and injustices, but rather itself is a product of white supremacy and structural racism. And so this is my paper, Modern Day Drapetomania, Calling Out Scientific Racism, written with my amazing sister scholars, that really began to spell this out and tie it into the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so essentially it's important to begin to understand that race was invented ultimately to implement racism. And so there's a saying that we usually have in terms of sorry, I need to manipulate some things on my screen, in health justice work, that racism invented race, right? And so race was invented in order to implement racism and maintain slavery, uphold white supremacism and anti-blackness, and essentially hoard economic and political power among white-bodied people. It is not a natural grouping that is somehow misused by bigoted lay people, but beneficially by unbiased doctors, right? No, it is it is absolutely there's an intention that's written into the way that is incorporated into clinical medicine and the algorithms that then are reproduced in technology. And these are amazing books. And again, I'm sure this group has read all this, but in case you haven't, you want to pick up one of these books that you see here, the 1619 Project, Medical Appetite, etc. And so what we're talking about is that this conversation lies inside the context of racial capitalism, right? Stolen land, stolen bodies, stolen labor, right? And so in order to justify that system, it is important, therefore, to somehow put forward and formalize a belief system and a way of knowing, an epistemology that naturally divides humans into so-called biologically distinct races, out of this 18th century, scientific enlightenment. but really the function and the purpose, and this is another point here for our students, etc., and folks that do this work, is to always be asking, well, what is the function of this policy, of this curriculum, of this program, of this initiative, of this idea, of this thought, of this discussion, right? What is the function? The function is to justify European and then later white American conquest, dispossession, and enslavement of other people. And physicians, American physicians particularly, played a unique role in the 19th century, promoting this racial concept of disease to legitimize the transatlantic slave trade and U.S. American chattel slavery, again, based on innate distinctions rather than on white supremacism. I was literally in a research meeting today where somebody talked about their study, again conflating race and ancestry and ethnicity to explain a biological difference as it relates to vitamin D according to ancestry. This thing is so ingrained in clinical practice and medical research and therefore policy process and educational systems, right? And the piece about it, and ultimately what is it in service of, is to dehumanize, right? Is to dehumanize, to say that folks in black bodies are not human and therefore naturally fit for exploitation and destruction. So whether it's the lynching rope, whether it's the whip, right, which Dr. Samuel Cartwright said was the cure for a madness. Dr. Idil does work on madness, right? The madness of an enslaved African to run away is, that became a disease that was pathologized, where black bodies and black natural human responses are somehow pathologized, and therefore his treatment, literally in his book, is to whip them. And so it justifies, therefore, the violence against black bodies, even in healthcare settings and in academia and in any on the streets, in the grocery store, in the library, just like, mind our business by the pool, whatever. The violence is justified because there's an inherent pathology in the black body. And that thinking has been replicated over and over again. Over here, this is a picture from the Tuskegee experiment. It justifies, being able to test, right, on black bodies and exploit and extract knowledge that benefits white-bodied people while denying treatment, right, to black-bodied individuals because you are not even human. It justifies policies that target black bodies. So the war on drugs, the war on crime, right, racist policies, eugenics and Nazism, forced sterilization, right? It justifies segregation policies, Jim Crow, redlining on all kinds of levels, housing, healthcare, internet, environment, reproductive injustice. You see what happened here on this side of the pond in the States, right, with the removal of Roe v. Wade, right? Voter suppression, genocide. It justifies these racist policies. And so in medicine, and this is again the phenomenal Dr. Dorothy Roberts, and you want to check out this TED talk that she gave, The Problem with Race-Based Medicine. It's used to create differential diagnoses, evaluation, management, and treatment. It's inculcated into our technology and allocating resources. It feeds itself into assumptions, and it's baked even into the machines and devices and algorithms and tech that we use across all disciplines in healthcare and beyond, and specialties. So this is a paper that talks about the spirometer, which tests the lung function test, and that machine is corrected for race. If you walk in and you need a lung function test in order to determine your what's going on with your lungs, if you are seen as a black person, there is a correction that is added because based on the belief by Samuel Cartwright. And this is well documented in London Brown's book. And I think London Brown is speaking tomorrow, actually, on this same topic. I believe in Queen's University, I don't know, somewhere. I'm happy to share the link later. However, if you walk in, you get corrected based on the belief by people like Dr. Samuel Cartwright that said that black folks have lower lung capacity for some magical reason. The pulse oximetry, up until recently, right, for the past few decades, we knew that the pulse oximeter, and that's a device that checks how much oxygen is in the body, reads higher numbers in dark-skinned individuals when really the oxygen in the body is low. So in this study that was done Black patients were seen to have 3 times the frequency of occult hypoxemia not detected by the pulse oximetry. Occult hypoxemia just means that your oxygen level is low, but the machine is saying it's high. And that happened 3 times more in dark-skinned individuals that happen to also identify as Black than those that were lighter skinned. Now think about COVID and how that contributed to the COVID-19 death, mortality, and morbidity disparities. X-ray machines, right? Black folks for a long period of time were given higher doses of radiation because the belief was that the skeleton of the Negro is heavier and bones are thicker, right? And that carried on for a very long time. The belief that Black folks had denser bones, more muscle, thicker skin, and so radiologists and technicians use higher radiation. Think about the risk for the long-term risk in terms of cancer and other radiation illnesses, the psychological cost because of, again, the reinforcement of dehumanization. And so there's incredible consequences, the cost and toll with Black folks experiencing incredible burden of preventable suffering, increased healthcare costs, lost days of work and income, disparities of health, wealth, and justice, morbidity, mortality, death. We saw this play out in the pandemic, which is ongoing. Don't be fooled. It's still ongoing. In the state of Michigan, where I reside, we have about 14% of our population are people of African descent, and we accounted for 40% of the deaths. I mean, it was ridiculous. And that was replicated throughout the country. Delayed diagnosis, misdiagnosis, delayed intervention, people getting turned away, lack of close surveillance, misallocation of resources, inappropriate treatment, misclassification of disease severity, access to life-saving procedures, all where happened and contributed to the disparities. And it's important that we understand that these level of injustices are intersectional, mutually reinforcing, and is compounded by technology with incredible healthcare costs. I won't go into that as much. I want to wrap up my comments. We see that play out in maternal mortality rates, where a Black woman who is pregnant is up to 4 times, and in Louisiana, I want to say that the numbers are in the percentage numbers are in double digits, likely to die than their white women counterparts. It doesn't matter her socioeconomic status. In fact, a highly educated, wealthy Black woman has about the same amount of risk as a poor high school dropout woman who is white in this country in terms of the outcomes. In this country, okay? And the beautiful way to really encapsulate the why is Congresswoman Cori Bush. In her comment in this paper, every day Black women die because the system denies our humanity. And this paper, again, talks about the driver of these outcomes is racism. It's not race per se. You got to talk about the way in which people who are racialized as Black are valued, and how that then shows up in our health outcomes. And it's what's interesting, I want to point this out, is it shows up in infant mortality. Again, remember, the United States leads the other fellow high-income countries in poor outcomes when it comes to women and babies. And so Black babies die or are killed at 3 times the rate of white newborns during their initial hospital stay. But what's interesting is that when they are taken care of by Black doctors, their mortality rate is cut into half. So is it the body? Is it that Black babies are inherently somehow deficit? No, there is something going on in the environment. And the implication for AI is that these biases, when you think about the context historically and otherwise, and the way that it shows up in practice, in research, and in policy and in education as outlined, right, are then used to train artificial intelligence, right? The biases are only perpetuated on a larger scale with wider impact. And Ruha Benjamin is just a goddess on this space, and you want to have these books if you don't. And there's some papers that have shown that millions of Black people affected by racial bias in healthcare algorithms. There's a study that showed that an algorithm determined the patients that got secondary care for complex cases. So you came in, you admitted, you were taken care of in the hospital, you're sent home. People who are really sick need follow-up so as to make sure that they stay healthy outside the hospital. Well, it turns out that Black people were less likely to be referred for that care, right? So that they'll be taken care of. In fact, for them to get that care, they had to be much sicker than white folks, because the way the algorithm was trained it started to discriminate against Black folks. And there's more details that I'm happy to share later, but that's the point. And then even in the electronic health record, we have negative patient descriptors compared to white patients. Black patients in this study had almost 3 times the odds of having at least one negative descriptor in the history and physical notes. And that is then used to train further technology that's only replicated, right? And there's a conversation that can be said, well, as Sister Audre Lorde said, can the master's tools be used to deconstruct or destroy the master's house? And there's some thoughts about, well, you know, in this study, algorithms actually recognize pain of Black patients more than when radiologists themselves were used to assess for pain. And so the algorithm actually did better than the radiologist. And so is there a way, and this is just a question, you know, that we could potentially train to mitigate bias or to deconstruct the structures and systems and cultures of white supremacy that can show up in technology? And that's a question, because many say yes, and many say no, and some say yes. And a Black feminist response, and this I took this from Digital Black Feminism by Catherine Knight Steele, could be that, well, maybe we can use the master's tools, but we're going to need to ask different questions. We're going to need to propose different framing. We're going to need to propose different practice, process, and the products, talk about the possibilities and constraints, and then redefine what technology is, and accept that we've always had a relationship with technology. So I want to end here. I've spoken a lot, and I appreciate your patience with me. But what is the implication and recommendation to move forward? What do we do on the backs of all this? The first step is that we just need to cease, desist, and divest from race correction and race-based medicine and scientific racism, period. Okay, with a capital T. Okay, to knowingly continue race correction in healthcare, to perpetuate it in technology and in many forms of just every society, is to commit medical malpractice while perpetuating white supremacism and producing racial and intersectional disparities. Because again, with AI, we knit race correction into the fabric of care, which essentially is medical practice on a grand scale, and the argument that this is a gross violation of human rights. Simply put, it is racist AF. Okay, and so the first step is to reckon with the history of medical racism, colonialism, and violence in North America, and right where you are. Another paper in The Lancet by the amazing Dorothy Roberts, you already know I love this woman, The Art of Medicine. Anti-racism in medicine therefore requires more than weeding out bias in the minds of individual physicians. So all this bias training, I mean, they're cute, but really we have to be about ending how medicine is structured to promote racist ideas, policies, and practices. And it's beginning to happen. We have the American Academy of Pediatrics that has talked about the impact of racism on child and adult health, and has removed race corrections in their some of and I want to say pretty much all, but the one that got the most publicity was on urinary tract infections. How do we calculate kids with urinary tract infections? American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology has removed race correction in their calculator for vaginal birth after a C-section. There's a calculator to determine what your risk is for negative outcomes if you do have a vaginal birth after C-section. That had a racial category there and placed Black women at higher risk, just on the fact that they were Black, okay, and nothing else. And that has been removed. In research, there are guidelines that have come up on how race, ethnicity, disparities, and contextual factors must be explicitly considered in studies design and in interpretation. Various standards and practice guidelines from a variety of organizations, and you can see some of them represented here, have started to come out in the ways that race and racism needs to be, discussed in this space. Excuse me. Advocacy is critical in this work. Medical education, and this is my program, HEGIM, which is my curriculum that I founded and I teach at Wayne State University. Transformation, how do we train doctors, nurses, and folks in healthcare to begin to make the change? Board exams need to change, assessment, evaluation, promotion and tenure, licensure, etc. And finally, advocacy is going to be really critical on the local, professional, national, and global levels, agitating for accountability and technology transparency, organizing and leveraging across, in a collective action across various sectors intersectionally. I'm a member of the Health Equities roundtable of the White House, as you know, and that's another form of advocacy. The FDA convened a panel on November 1st to look at these pulse oximeters, and that's because of the noise that many of us are making on the grassroots. And we need to be advocating for reparations, period. And there's a lot of work that has come out to support that. So I want to end my comments here with thanking you. The other thing that we can all do is join the coalition and go to endracecorrection.com. This is the QR code, but endracecorrection.com is the website. Participate in AMART, Anti-Racism Medicine Action Roundtable, every Saturday, 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Twitter and YouTube. This is our website where you can see our previous work, and it's on this website right here. That's the QR code for that. And you again, remember those 5 keys that we talked about. Race is a sociopolitical construct. It's not the same as ancestry. Racism is the vector of disease and not race. And disparities are not accidental but intentional by design. And continuing race correction is racist and is essentially malpractice. This is my comment. This is my contact information. You can reach me on social media at INNODIM. You can email me here. And thank you. And throwing it back to Jackie to continue the facilitation.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Opara. I did actually have a question when you were talking at the end about reparations and kind of how this anti-Black racism is embedded in the medical system and medical education and all of the schools. I know in 2008, the American Medical Association formally apologized for their role in anti-Black racism specifically. And then, 10 years later, they had their first African-American female doctor as a president. And I was wondering if you've noticed this kind of trickling down to, or this kind of sentiment or these changes trickling down to medical schools, because that also is where these changes need to be made. Because as people are coming into medicine and learning these very racist practices, things will not change, even if the American Medical Association is saying sorry for their role that, happened over many, many years.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And just pardon me, I'm trying to also sort of come out of here, or maybe you can kick me out, Jackie. So it always takes me a minute to come out of this section. So the question you asked is, as the AMA apologized for, and by the way, for you all that the American Medical Association is the United States of America largest physician group, and played a huge role in enforcing white supremacism. They excluded Black doctors and didn't want and refused for Black doctors to join them, to the point that is what caused Black physicians in America, in the United States of America, to form the National Medical Association, NMA. That was in response to the systemic and systematic exclusion of Black physicians from the American Medical Association. The American Medical Association opposed Medicaid. American Medical Association supported Jim Crow segregation. I mean, it was the arm of the KKK, frankly. And so the American Medical Association has participated in and perpetuated incredible harm against Black folks in this country. So yes, as Jackie said, 2008 they apologized. They came together with the National Medical Association and the Latinx physicians group as well, and have done a few things. And the point of the matter, when we talk about reparations, we are talking, that's not reparations, that's apology, but that's not repair. Right? And there's actually a United Nations, and later I'll put it in the chat. The chat is disabled, but I could talk about it later. But maybe my phenomenal, brilliant sisters, know about it and can talk about it. There are various components to what reparations is that the United Nations actually has put together. And so what that was an apology, but that's not reparative justice. And so to your question, there needs to be a multi-pronged approach to reparations and repair in healthcare, certainly societally, period, right, from the U.S. government. And some of the slides I took out of this was talked about there is actually a bill in Congress that has been stalled, that was sponsored by people like Representative Cory Booker, etc., to just study reparations, just to study it and make recommendations. And that has been stalled for since 2020, right? There was a proliferation after the murder of George Floyd. There's a proliferation of all these acts. We have the George Floyd Police Brutality Act. We had the Anti-Racism in Public Health Act. We had the Commission to Study Reparations Act that came out, but they've all been stalled because, you know, power doesn't want to cede itself, right, without being forced to. And so there needs to be certainly reparations at that level, but there needs to be specific reparations when it comes to health care and medicine. And that's going to be a more not more complex, but more involved, you know, approach that is going to include economic pieces, because there is an account. There's literally, we have, you know, dollar amounts for what it has cost to systemically and systematically perpetuate harm against Black lives, right, inside of the healthcare system by exclusion of appropriate treatment, or by actually perpetuating treatment that was unnecessary due to the integrated algorithmic approach that is rooted in white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and scientific racism. So that is one example of the beginnings of a conversation, but that conversation isn't complete. But to your question, absolutely, from an education angle, the medical schools needs to be done. From a professional standpoint, needs to be done. From a regulatory standpoint, needs to be done. From a governmental standpoint, needs to be done. All pieces are going to be required to get on the table and as part of this conversation around reparations. And that's why I shared the resources so that folks can also do their own sort of reading on this. Quite a few papers and a couple of very good books have come out on this now.
Thank you so much.
Great question. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a couple of reminders. One, for closed captioning, just have to try to be mindful to go a little bit slower so that the closed captioning can happen. And I also wanted to commend you on when your child came up and just like taking the time to talk that down. That was very sweet. I liked that a lot. So I don't know, Lana, if you would like to go next. You're on mute.
I want to first of all apologize for speaking fast. You know, I'm Nigerian. We have this bad habit. And then also, I think it's also me. Let me not just blame my country. It's also me. So I'm a work in progress, and I will do better. If there's anything anybody wants me to repeat, okay, see, I'm talking fast again. I'm also really time conscious. That's the other problem, because I usually have a lot to say, and I'm trying to force it in 2 seconds. So it's a balance, and I'm a work in progress. So, you know, pray for me and keep helping me. But I appreciate your patience.
It's Idil speaking. Just really quickly, a reminder for folks that the discussions will be uploaded, and we will also have the closed caption transcript for folks to be able to access. And that's certainly not in lieu of today's ASL and deaf interpretation. However, something that I thought is important to share. So Lana, I'll go ahead and invite you back to the discussion.
Hi, Jackie. Yeah, I'm looking forward to getting into the conversation that now is going to kick off. So if you want to pose the first question, I can move in, and then Idil, and we can incorporate the comments as we go, because Dr. Ijeoma Opara did an amazing job, gave us a wonderful foundation. You have a very clear understanding. And I will reiterate, you must fundamentally understand the difference between what happens as a result of white supremacy and what is actually materially real. Because often what white supremacy causes is the forcing of us to live in a imagined world of evidence that is not reflected in the actual empirical data. And since we're talking about Black women, non-binary people, the implications of risk, evaluation, and what that means for facial recognition, as well as medical imaging. And Dr. Opara alluded to that when she described the issues with radiology and excessive radiology use in order to image the bones of Black folks. And so I'm looking forward to diving into the conversation.
Yeah, so maybe my first question would be on thinking about AI algorithms and the way that generally they become publicly available or used, I guess, as decision tools for clinicians or in healthcare generally. As Dr. Opara had mentioned, a lot of these data are being collected through anti-Black racism. We're seeing a lot of data that's just not being collected. It's basically through the way that patients are treated, the way that specifically I would say Black women are treated in the healthcare system, and then trying to feed that in to develop an AI algorithm. But if we are learning from that, what can we learn? And how can we adjust what data we have based on knowing this anti-Black racism, knowing that these data are not actually accurate and not actually beneficial to the people that they're supposed to be beneficial to?
I think it's important for all of us to take time, especially those of us who are in the work on the side of computational sciences and the work of systems flow and patients flow, to explain and share a bit of the architecture. So I'll do that right now in my answer. And so what I mean by architecture is often we're meant to think of data as information. These are actually two different things. And what that means is information is, for instance, the presentation of my name and the bottom of the screen where it says Lana James, and then it has my pronouns as she, her, and they. And so that is information because it's in context and it's below my picture. So we know that in terms of custom, that means it's referring to my name. That's information. Data, on the other hand, is what we deal with when we're working with code, and you might have a string of equations, zeros and ones, and various symbols, and that is in fact data. And so, for example, if this was written in code, it would not look like Lana James, she, her, and they, right? It would look like there's a lot of extra letters and none of them look like ones I'm familiar with. And so that is data. And so data are things that are created for the purpose of processing. They are not the same things as information. Information is what we're typically used to handling and using when we conversate. So another example is when someone sees their address, you would have, the street number, your unit number, and then the street name, and there's a convention for that. Again, if this was data, all you would see is a set of numbers in no particular convention. And almost you would wonder, does this person not understand punctuation or any of the customs? And so data is key, here's the key, is without context. It is without context, and it is raw, meaning that it can be then manipulated into any function or form. Information comes with a convention. It at least has parameters that one can work through and understand, and one need not have a particular set of computational knowledges. And so often when we're talking about data, we're actually talking about computationally accessible and usable data. We are not all talking about the same thing. So I often hear people talking about data when what they need is information, and talking about information as if it's data. And while it may seem semantic, it is not. One, many of us who are trained in the conventions of whatever the tongue is that we're used to sharing can communicate and discuss without a level of specialization. Data, on the other hand, requires you to have specialization of a language, i.e. any Python, R, any kind of computational language, and there are many, as well as understanding the conventions specific to that particular subdiscipline of data. And so there's a reason why we have this change in language. There's a reason why we as human beings are encouraged to talk about data and not talk about information, because we have a long history of information and how information should be regulated and how it's shared. And we have many laws around how that works. That's why in Canada, and I'm Canadian by nationality, we have something called the CRTC, the Canadian Regulatory Telecommunications Body. And that's about managing information in ways that we understand. Data, on the other hand, is an invention of the business sector, because typically, think about 10 years ago, did you talk about data unless you were in the sciences or you were talking about a data set? No. So we're seeing a shift in language where we're taking away context, taking away conventions in which we understand and ways in which we know to address things in ways that are right and wrong and where we need to have consent, and increasingly having our language shifted to the language of transactional monetization. And that's why we talk about data, because they're the units in which we transact for the purpose of business or computation. They are not supposed to give us a connection directly to humans, which is who information is for. Data is for computation, computers, and specialists, and information is something that we all are engaged in. And so the architecture of data and how data moves is important. And so very often what happens is that lay people are left to think that data is information. And so what is obscured is that data is more about capital. So that means generating profit. And we know that in a capital system, the cost of that profit is never actually ever assessed. And what I mean by that is we're encouraged to order things online or to use our computers for everything, but we're not encouraged to think about what is the cost and who is paying it. So when we order, we know that there are Amazon workers who are in warehouses that are 100 degrees, who are moving at inhumane paces for the purpose of profit and to get something to us in a day or less. And when it comes to computation, we're never made to think about the context. So when we hit the keyboards and we're able to do a particular kind of computation, we're not meant to think about the dams, the destruction, the electricity, all of the carbon and methane that's being produced. And most importantly, all of the minerals that are needed to operate these computational devices that are actually going right back to the same sites of violence for Black folks and across the Americas to extract resources. So the architecture of data has a lot of violence in it, and violence that is actually targeting the very same people. Those are the descendants of the transatlantic, the continent of Africa, the Americas as a region, South, Central, and North. And to be clear, in terms of what Global Mining points out in their official documentation, that the largest sites of all of the, quote, rare earth minerals and necessary minerals for current technology, the majority of them lie in Africa, with China bringing a close second. The difference being that Africa has been subdivided into 50 plus different countries, and China has one particular set of political governance, for the lack of a better term, and is extracting those more readily, not having to address the same legislative, political boundaries and whatnot. And so understanding the architecture of data is to also understand how the world is currently structured and how data is being used to obscure the language of speaking about data, to obscure all of those environmental violences, all of those mining accidents. I mean, let's be clear, the Democratic of Congo's conflict is not the Democratic of Congo's conflict. It's the conflict of Russia, China, India, the United States, Canada, and all of the other countries that are major players in tech. And there's a couple links I can try to share that can be shared with those who have registered and posted on the website, pointing out how this chain works. And so if we don't think about what's behind the veil, what is meant to be disappeared, then we continue to talk about data rather than talking about all that it entails and whether we mean information. Because I'll give an example. When we think about what can be adjusted, the first thing we need to adjust is the reality frame of our lens. Much of what's presented to us in technology, and I do use these technologies, I want to be clear. I have the pleasure of working on really interesting projects. I work with Dr. Amber Simpson at Queen's University. She's a computational biologist and the Canada Research Chair, one of the few women that do that work. And my role is to look at cancers and metastasizations. I also do diagnostic work. So I'm heavily engaged, but it's not without deep thought. It's not without contemplating, what are the ethics of this? What is actually possible? Am I saving those of us who get to be in the Americas, because we're in first world countries, air quotes, for those who can't see what I've just done with my hands, and throwing our relatives, our kin across the world under the bus? And so this is a real issue, and constantly when I'm in meetings, I have to remind my peers, whether they're physicians or computational scientists or anywhere in between, is this really the best way to go about this? Just because we can doesn't mean we should. So one of the first things that we need to adjust is our frame of reference and who is paying the cost and who is gaining the benefit, and to actually calculate that with the people who are involved in that entire process. Because what we see continuously, I was in a meeting and actually presenting, and it was in radiology. I did a presentation in radiology, as well as a more general presentation. And I also had the opportunity to attend another talk. And it was both wonderful to see colleagues doing amazing work in cancer and wanting to do work that will change care. But when we talk about things like real-time cancer diagnosis, we need to adjust our lens and understand who that's for, what that's about, and what the cost is. Because it takes a particular kind of technology, right? And that technology uses particular kinds of minerals and produces a massive carbon footprint that will raise the temperature of the planet greater than 2 degrees. And I'm just talking about one sub area of artificial intelligence, right? So my areas of natural language processing and medical imaging alone, just one alone, you got 2 degrees. So if you go across the 13 major areas of artificial intelligence, you've got a planet on fire. And so that's not being talked about in Egypt. It wasn't talked about, and it continues not to be talked about. And that's because we have to recognize the big 6 of the big 9. So there's 9 major corporate players in tech that pretty much define the field, supply chains and whatnot, including the stock exchange, some would argue. And that's not a conversation that many of them want. And so therefore, we are left with conversations about data. So what do we have to adjust? What do we have to calculate? That if we're going to center the lives of Black women, whether they are cis or trans or however we are identified as Black women, as non-binary peoples, as peoples living with different kinds of disabilities and working through different frames of reference, if we cherish all of those and understand what it means to be treaty people, it means we have to reframe the conversation about our kinship, our ecosystem, about what life and living is actually about. Because unfortunately, technologically, we have seen time and time again with the advent of every new technology, a failure to calculate the loss of life and the loss of environment. And just to kind of bring that home, it's a rude awakening when you actually do the math of the amount of energy burned to even develop some of these technologies, and to know that in many of our own communities, there is mold in housing, there is unclean water, there is insufficient cooling in the summer, but yet in our very downtown core, we will have machines that allow for us to be on the internet to have air conditioning, while elders swelter and babies get overheated. And so there is a trade-off, and we're being encouraged to think about data, not about information, and to leave context in order to refocus on a very white and shiny future of technological determinism. So I hope that gives you a really good sense of the architecture, the context, and some of the language that is used to obscure, so that we might delve into further conversation.
Thank you so much for that. I wanted to see, Idil, if you wanted to chime in, if you had anything that you wanted to bring in at this point, or if we should just have a conversation.
Yeah, well, I'm going to try well, firstly, just for those who are looking on screen, I currently have my camera off just for access and internet reasons. So what you see on the screen is just an image of me with my hand on my head and a scarf, colorful scarf, earrings, red lipstick, and a coat on. But I will be continuing to speak without the camera on. There's not much to say because my sisters did that. Like, I don't really know if there's anything else for me to say. So very thankful to Ijeoma and Lana. I guess maybe for me, what's easiest for me to draw on, which I maybe wasn't expecting to draw on this evening, might be, I guess, a recent article actually that I've submitted to the American Journal of Community Psychology, which actually looks at sort of the closest area of interest to me, which is that of mental health, and particularly the location in which I live and write from in what is so-called Canada right now. And so maybe what I'll just do is maybe pick up on a couple of critical points that have been brought forward by my colleagues this evening, and maybe just try to work through that in the context specifically of mental health and AI-based interventions, particularly in that context, and maybe further kind of elaborate on how I think that impacts Black people in particular. And so if folks are interested in sort of reading the broader piece around that, I really invite you to have a read through that special issue. But I think to pick up specifically from Sister Ijeoma, one of the things that particularly resonated with me from your discussion and from the points that you highlighted was, quite frankly, put simply, race is a social construct, and more specifically a social construct which has material and deleterious impacts and outcomes. And so I think what the three of us here are actually wondering or really sitting with and lamenting about today is ultimately, like, what is gained from the sustained commitment to reinscribing race as a marker of biological difference? And quite frankly, who benefits from that? And if we continue to approach it this way, how then do we understand calls for increased race medicine or race-based data as a further technological tool or apparatus that further entrenches racist ideologies under the guise of, quote, equity and diversity? So Dr. Ijeoma, that's sort of like one of my first kind of like responses and lamentations to that, kind of put really, really simply, again, from a practitioner perspective and from a researcher perspective. And thankfully, you know, I think back to when I first learned research, right? Like I actually thankfully entered learning research from a paradigm specifically of a woman of the global South who actually brought me to understand this through ideologies of like the untouchable. And so quite early, sort of like as an undergraduate student, and as a Black woman, as a Black Muslim woman, all these other kinds of identities in which I occupy, that idea of untouchability kind of resonated with me, quite frankly, throughout my career, right? Or like even my research career, and like how I think about what untouchability means. And so one of the things in which I write about in this new piece is really like the impact of that idea of untouchability, like as a third year kind of student sitting in that class, then further thinking about like the impact of untouchability and what that then would do for like interventions to work and to like research and how we think about people, right? Again, because the people that I'm closest to are those who are untouched. Those who touch is refused, those who touch is criminalized, those who touch is actually revoked by virtue of madness, by virtue of disability, by virtue of being othered, both in gender, in race, in religion, in status, etc. But maybe to return to kind of the latter part of the question and to sort of continue to expand on the example that Lana provided, again, I really want to use the example to really think about and collectively reconsider like how it is that we imagine and sort of think about notions of artificial intelligence. Largely, I guess, because for me, I think what most people think about, or maybe it's because what I thought about originally before I kind of started diving into AI, computational science, and like broader ideas of like people management, through technology, which was later in my graduate studies, I really kind of imagined like stuff on TV, right? Like I wasn't, you know, and that probably doesn't sound like super academic of me, but that's actually and significantly what I imagined insofar as I wasn't at a place yet where I could truly assess the kind of ubiquity of what these systems, functions, and tools are. And so to that end, I personally began thinking about that and considering like what AI was from perspectives closest, like nearest and dearest to me. And I'd invite you to do the same as we have this discussion this evening, which is to really think about like, what do we do in our personal and intimate lives? Like, what are the apparatuses most closest to us? And so one of the things I'd ask you to think about is mobile devices, mobile phones, and more specifically, smartphones. And the reason why I want us to think about smartphones particularly is because what we know and like through kind of research and data is that like about 4 billion people use mobile internet. And these numbers are like, quite frankly, only expected to increase by about 2025. And so in that context, I guess I ask us to consider, you know, the kinds of biometric data that is collected through our individual active and passive use of these kinds of devices. And so by, you know, active use, I mean by like the information that we sort of provide willingly and with consent to apps, vis-a-vis sort of ideas of passive data collection, which are often the more like unseen kinds of ways that people collect data. And these are often like sort of submerged and embedded within apps without our knowledge. So sort of to, like, I keep saying sort of, but to invite you to think about like examples like wrist-worn devices, right? So Apple Watches, Fitbits, et cetera. These kinds of technologies actually have specific data indicators within them that look at something called like at the accelerator meter of data, which essentially monitors and assesses the frequency and intensity and duration of individual physical activity, right? And so we may not think that that is information or data that is maybe being put or collected or stored somewhere else. But when we think about the ubiquity of a cell phone or a wrist-worn device, and what that does, I think it's really important to think about like, what are the kinds of embedded technologies in these devices, right? So like one of the major things if we think about is like, I think it's called like electrocardiogram or ECG data. And this is like often found within like Apple Watches. It has the ability to kind of continuously track your heart rate, et cetera. We also have things that are like considered electrodermal activity or EDA, which refers to the electric kinds of properties of our individual skin, right? And so as we talk about race and all these different kinds of things, like what I also in that case like want us to think about how electrodermal data has an impact on racialized skin, right? So, and this really has an impact, or the idea of this kind of intervention is that this kind of electronic dermal data can in fact reflect cognitive and emotional processes within our nervous system, right? And then there are kind of those more, known kinds of applications, right? So GPS data, location. We all know that our phones have cameras in them. But one of the new and like actually more interesting pieces of research and data that is by Rue, spelled R-U-E et al. And this is a 2021 article, which I actually found quite interesting, is the actual use of cameras for facial expression in order to signal particular kinds of mental health illness. So for example, this particular research team, Rue et al., developed a system that opportunistically captures facial expressions throughout the day using a frontal camera of the phone, and that these kinds of smartphones are then able to kind of really provide a larger global scale about like facial expressions essentially throughout the day. And so I think then in that context, and when I talk about kind of like this idea of having this like really ubiquitous thing in your hand, the cell phone that we use, and like we may turn off the location and we may turn off our GPS, but we may not worry about our mindfulness meditation app that we have on our phone that we think is just reminding us about certain kinds of things, right? And so aside from the pandemic, I think it's really important for us to think about the fact that particularly within the United States, we see that there's been a like $14 or $15 million rise in venture capital funding towards specific like health-related mobile apps. And more specifically, among that kind of broader number, we see that there's a focus or a spotlight or like a interest in mental health related kinds of apps. In fact, so much so that they've created a new category of health called small m health, capital H. And this particular industry, in fact, at the end of 2021, raised $5.1 billion in clinical indications, as well as individual service users. And again, this is only expected to increase far much more. And in this context, a large part of what we see and what these apps are actually doing is they're monitoring things like compliance. They are largely monitoring things that are self-reported. It's also really important to highlight the piece that there is actually no clinician attached to or assessing the information that individuals provide. And so therefore there are bots that are responding to this, and those particular bots, and I think I'll stick a pin in that piece because we can talk about it later, have particular kinds of impacts and responses to racialized kinds of people. And so I think that that's something else that we can consider. And I think ultimately the largest piece is, while mental health apps are the fastest and largest growing number of digital apps in the sort of app sphere, what we know is that there is no regulation or evidence-based information about the utility of those kinds of practices. And again, I'll come back a little bit later to focus more on like the kind of race pieces, but just I thought maybe in response to some of this, it might be quite crucial to give a bit of a landscape about what's happening here. So I'll go ahead and leave it there for now and maybe return to a few of these comments later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I wanted to remind everyone that if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A, and we're actively going through that. So if you have any questions for the panelists, please go ahead. I had another question that is maybe a little bit different than what we've been talking about already. So if you guys want to go back to something that was already said, feel free to ignore my question. But Dr. Opara, when I went to your LinkedIn, I saw you had posted recently about the number of Black female physicians and that those numbers are actually going down. So it's quite small. It was the 2%, I think you said, of all physicians in the United States. And that's a really, really small number. And the fact that it's going down is really, really upsetting. It made me think about when you were talking in your presentation about the infant mortality. I believe it was infant mortality. I'm not sure if it was in childbirth, a birthing person dying during childbirth. I can't remember which one it was, but that people treated with a Black physician, they had cut that mortality in half. And so I was wondering if you or maybe the other people had some things to, talk about more on that, because that's really, I think, a very clear example of anti-Black racism, of culturally competent care, of things that are really needed for different communities to be able to survive even very normal medical situations that people are going through.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think that's a great question. Before I answer that one, I want to go back to what Dr. Idil was speaking about, because I think it was fantastic. And also, of course, Sister Lana is always brilliant in really her deconstruction of pretty much any topic that she puts her hands on. And I appreciated that differentiation of data and information. Because I think it's linked to, what Dr. Idil was talking about, and as I was listening, and I was grateful for really bringing up this idea of smart apps, smartphones and the apps, because it's beautiful sort of intersection around what we're talking about when we're talking about, race-based medicine, how it gets cooked into technology, and the sort of the learning, what are the cohorts that are used to teach, artificial intelligence, and who is providing that data, and the intersectionality with capitalism, as Sister Lana said, whereby data oftentimes, the language of data is really the language of transaction, and that usually used to obscure the intention of profit making, right? The intention of capitalism at the end of the day. And I think, one of the best sayings in the entire history of people, especially in this part of the world, I think that has ever been said is follow the money. Like just if there's nothing else we don't know in life, if you could just know this, just follow the money. If you're able to know and understand what is going on, why this, why that, follow the money. Start with that, and then you can go from there to unpack. And so, I was quickly looking up some information based on what Dr. Idil was speaking about. And, in the United States, of course, I'm not in Canada, so I can't speak to Canada, but in the United States, because of digital redlining or technological redlining. And what is that? Redlining was the government policy and law that pretty much officialized segregation, residential segregation, and then tied every other resource in society to residents, so that essentially you were effectively segregating everything else. So the quality of your hospital and your clinic or healthcare resource is tied to your residents. The quality of education is tied to your property taxes, so where you live. Everything's where you live, and that's why we say that what is going to determine your health outcomes and experiences is your zip code, not your genetic code. And I don't know if y'all have zip codes over here, but over here, the residences and cities and space geography is organized by zip codes, and so we say your zip code will determine your outcomes more than your genetic code, so to speak. That's the only code you need, and that is by design. So the government gave out or sponsored or there's a whole detail to it, mortgages, to allow the banking system to offer mortgages to people along the lines of race. And by so doing, they pretty much carved out cities and red lines. Some areas were red, some areas were green, and some areas were yellow. And so the red areas were for the Negroes and the Jews, okay? And if you applied for a loan to buy a house in where was green or yellow, you were denied. That practice was supposed to have been deaded in the 60s. This went on from the 30s or so to the 60s, but it continues to today. Just, it's not official, but the legacy of that continues today, where Black folks' houses are continue to be appraised hundreds of thousands less than white folks' homes, and the list goes on and on and on. And so I'm saying all that to say that determined a lot in terms of, again, segregation, right? Including technology, including access to internet and broadband, for example. So what did that lead to? A larger portion of our population, of Black and brown populations, depend on smartphones for the internet access, right? And there was a recent article that was written by a brilliant investigative journalist, and I tweeted about this, that really broke down how digital redlining, and y'all text me or message me if I'm talking too fast, I'm trying to be conscious. Digital redlining, it's how it continues, how you can literally pay $50 for, or rather, one neighborhood was being charged, I want to say, about $50 for 5 megabytes, and then 9 minutes away in a richer, wider neighborhood, they were being charged I don't know, $10 or so for about the same. There's so many ways that these things happen, and then they're explained by saying, oh, demand, and there's so many ways, right? That's why we call it structural racism, because The shit is structured. So with that being with that being said, the larger number or percentage of Black and brown populations or communities depend on their smartphone for internet access. And a Pew Research poll showed that part of a significant portion of their use of the internet is for health related information, right? And when you do that, part of that also, and this will be interesting, and Dr. Idil brings up so many interesting thoughts here, and I don't know, and I have to do a search, and Dr. Idil, maybe if you've seen it, you let me know, about studies about the use of health apps specifically, and how it breaks down by race. I haven't seen that yet, but I also haven't done a good search, so that's homework for me. And so, and I think at Dr. Idil, I see that you will fill me in a bit. But just to finish the thought, so what am I saying? Black and brown communities that are already rendered socially vulnerable because of white supremacy and structural racism are placed at higher vulnerability, right? At a higher vulnerability for the interaction or engagement with these tools that expose us to releasing information and or data, and Lana can correct me which one is appropriate here, to the corporations that then translate that into profit. And this is one of the ways then that, you know, the complexity of these pieces. And what has happened historically is that we have always sort of been the teaching material, right? We provide the information, the data and the information to these institutions of science and academy and business and enterprise through the North American chattel slavery system and beyond. We provide that information from our bodies, literally. We did that in medicine and science, right? The picture on my introductory slide is that of Henrietta Lacks, and I'm hoping that you all know who Henrietta Lacks is. She's the lady whose cervical cells pretty much was the foundation of all modern discovery at this point, right? Including the COVID vaccine, and it was extracted from her without consent and without compensation. She and her family, and so we've always been the teaching material, right? Whether we realized it or not, we've always, our bodies, our minds, our behaviors have always been used to extract information and knowledge, but has never really come down back to benefit us. So it goes to benefit usually whites, predominant, communities and peoples, but the material is extracted from us, without compensation, and then profit is provided at the other end. And so understanding the ways in which that whole process is obscured, as Lana said, and how that intersects with justice in the tech space and health, I think is a critical conversation. It's a critical conversation. So I just really want to appreciate that offering with that. And then, I'll quickly respond to you, Jackie. In terms of the less than 2%, right? United States of America, physicians, essentially 5% are Black or African American or Black, and less than 2% of that are Black women. And that number is dwindling because what is happening is that because anti-Blackness still continues unabated. It's still ever ongoing. Many of us experience misogyny. We experience sexism and racism. In the workplace, and are forced out of training and or working in very racist, toxic workspaces. And so the numbers, are unfortunately, dwindling, and to your point around what happens when the mortality rate of Black babies are cut in half, when there's a Black doctor that takes care of them, those numbers are improved when there's more of us in the space. So in spaces where there are Black physicians present and active, and there is appropriate representation, those you see better retention of us in these spaces. In healthcare and academia, which is kind of like a vicious cycle, right? Because we're also being, being removed and extracted from these spaces, yet it requires us to be present to help retain us. So this vicious cycle, to me, and I think often of Dr. Idil's work in madness, is madness, is maddening. It's maddening, and there's conversations to be had about how we address that. So I think those were great questions. Thank you. I'm really curious to know. I think Dr. Idil had some information to add to that conversation, and also Lana's thoughts on this.
Yeah, actually, one of the things that I wanted to share about, in particular, like the increased use of mobile apps in mental health is actually for the purposes of like access and equity. So it's this idea that diverse populations, silently, Black people particularly, don't access mental health services, and therefore using the app might create the opportunity to do as such, right? Firstly, and I think the other part about it is that like it offers individuals an opportunity, or like service providers, systems, to monitor compliance of patients, people, and communities, right? And I guess one of the things that you were seeing around the idea of diversity, which they're, or anti-Blackness or Blackness, right? They're still referring to that as cultural competency within the sort of digital app sphere around race medicine, which I think in itself is its own problem and crisis. That said, they're currently, in sort of my last check of this, which was in early 2022, there are only 2 studies that actually focus on the experiences and or uses of mental health apps. And I'm not talking about other kinds of app, be it diabetes or, because there are multiple kinds of health monitoring apps. Again, I'm speaking to the area of my expertise and interest. But there are only 2 studies that actually look at the experiences of Black people and app utilization among the myriad of research studies and systemic reviews and meta-analysis on these issues. And so I think, I guess one of the other critical points that and maybe again, from the location that I'm in, and I've written about this in public space, along with 2 of my amazing students, about the PocketWell app, which is actually what I'm writing about in the other, in the American Community Psychology Journal, which is that the PocketWell app in Canada, which is a mental health app, was actually launched moments after the murder of George Floyd. And specifically when the Canadian government announced the purpose of this app, they announced it as a response also to racial equity. And so in that moment, I thought that one of the important things to do was kind of create an intervention around how we think about like health access, how we think about the exploitation of vulnerable people more generally, right? And I'm using the word vulnerable here in the context of like dominant discourses, but it's quite telling that the highest ranking number of health apps are mental health apps, right? And mental health apps without evidence. And in fact, and I really want to tie this to this narrative here, which is another area of interest for me, which is this idea of digital therapeutic alliances, which in fact completely remove the individual, the practitioner, the therapist, the social worker, the whoever from the conversation. And so again, in that kind of therapeutic relationship and that therapeutic engagement, the subversive discourse is in fact that if we use machine learning and AI, that removes any kinds of bias or issues, et cetera. So take the person out, let's use the machine, as if in fact, it's not humans who use generalizable data and algorithmic data, predictive data, racist, predictive, anti-Black, sanist, like all the isms data, right? It's these individuals who actually input this. So these aren't benign, ubiquitous, apps that are actually, without their own kind of inherent biases. And so I think that that's really important. And the other kind of really unique point I think that's really important to mention is, while there certainly is like a really huge uptake of the use of like mobile phones and mobile devices, I think it's really important to name, and this is like, again, from a research study by Stanworth that identifies that there is like 184 million fewer women who own mobile phones in comparison to men. And additionally, I think above and beyond that, what I'd like to add to that is that there's also a significant kind of like literacy gap in the use of these apps, right? And so we have to, taken together, really think about ideas of like so indeed, lots of people have mobile devices, lots of people have smartphones. Not everybody has subscriptions. In fact, the lowest country per capita that doesn't have or that doesn't subscribe to online apps in the world is Eritrea, located in Eastern Africa. And so like I think that those distinctions are important, but I think that still globally the fact that women are the ones who don't have access to mobile devices, again, an interest for me for my research, speaks to something quite unique. So I'll go ahead and leave it there unless there are other questions that come forward.
I was wondering if I could share a slide just for a moment, because I know that, and I want to go back a little bit and offer my apologies for not describing myself. So I'll try that out. And it looks like this. I am a deep caramel, brown colored woman, would be otherwise described in the racial category of Black. I have my hair cover wrapped, and it's in muted shades of green and caramel browns, as is my shirt, which is a solid color, and I'm wearing a multi-beaded necklace. I'm also wearing glasses, and behind me are all of my favorite things, which are my plants and a picture of my grandmother as I talk to you. So I offer my apologies for not giving a description of myself. I'm going to share the screen, and I'll do my best to do a narration of what is on the screen. And I'm sharing it for the purpose of giving a better articulation of data versus information so that I can continue responding. And let's do it like this. So can everybody see that very large?
Yeah.
And so this is from a presentation I did at Dalhousie Law School, and you can find it on Dalhousie Law School's website in their Institute of Health and Law. And I spoke about a few provocations, but if you'll notice the top box, so it's a PowerPoint slide, and what we're focusing on in this PowerPoint slide are two boxes. The top box has an example of data, and it provides an address, but ordered in the way that data is. And the bottom box gives you an example of information. And as you remember, I described that information is contextualized, it follows conventions that many of us can understand, and we share as a language based on time, place, and space. And so in the example on the bottom, it has traditional address written as Joe Smith, 1234 Circle Road, for example, Salt Lake City, comma, UT for Utah, a zip code, and a telephone number. The top box is an example of data, and it is ordered in the way that we would have it for a computational or raw data purpose. And so it has UT at the front, comma, 123, comma, Joe, comma, circle, comma, SLC, comma, the entire zip code, to entire phone number, unbroken, comma, the zip code, unbroken, and then Smith at the end. And so if someone was to just receive the top box example of data, would anybody recognize that as an address? They would think, oh, I've got some information. Maybe there's somebody named Joe Circle. Is SLC a place? And is this a phone number? So when you look at that, or you are given that information in this order, it follows no convention. It is many letters and numbers, but without context, without the social convention, without that, it is undistinguishable as information. Whereas below, we have the first name, the last name, the address number, the street, those follow convention. So we can look at that and say, oh, that's the address of Joe Smith. And we can then act on that without the need of further interpretation or computational assistance or languages. I wanted to share that because, addresses are conventional pieces of information that many of us are accustomed to seeing and doesn't require any specialization. But when you look at the vast difference between these two pieces of information, and this is very simple, we're not talking about invented categories of race, we're not talking about clinical diagnostics, we're not talking about radiographs, medical images from CT scans, we're just talking about regular language that many of us are familiar with. You can see how it becomes uninterpretable. And I wanted to circle back to something that Dr. Abdillahi, as well as Dr. Opara, gestured to, and that is artificial intelligence and its intersection with, clinical practice and mental health. And I'd like to point out that we must understand that when we talk about artificial intelligence, we are not, in fact, always talking about the same thing. And so I like to remind people that artificial intelligence is neither artificial nor is it intelligent. And what do I mean by that? I mean that it is not artificial because it is data. Remember the difference? That's why I showed you the slide. Data, which is a bunch of letters, numbers, and in computation, there's a lot of symbols and other stuff going on. Data does not come without a context. It is dissembled to be uncontextual so that it can be moved, used, manipulated, primarily for the purpose of other people's benefit, because transactions produce different kinds of wealth and currency exchanges. And so when we think about artificial intelligence, what we're talking about is what has happened in the past, broken down into singular units of data, meaning uncontextualized information, and recombinated and manipulated. I'm moving my hands in a circle and going in and out to describe the ways in which the data that you saw as an address could be broken up, linked to various other pieces of data, and recombined to produce more information about Joe Smith, but with no context. And so without context, we have no meaning. And therefore, the artificial intelligence component, the artificial component, is the artifice of taking what is information, reducing it to data, and then creating that which is not true by recontextualizing it in a way that it was never intended. We follow that? So it's artificial in that it does not represent the truth within the context that it occurred. When I say truth, I'm talking about the sequence of events. For instance, if you have your electronic medical record, or you have a transcript from a conversation from working with a mental health professional, an artificial intelligence algorithm will break that up and take it and attach it to disparate pieces of information, maybe your driver's license at the transportation office, your online posts, if it's all within one ecosystem, as has come to be the case in Canada. It may be that, for instance, the owners of Shoppers Drug Mart are also the owners of Loblaws, which are also the owners of the electronic medical and health records. And your loyalty card from one and your prescriptions from another. And then maybe you've also signed up for some other loyalty options or are accessing some other types of equipment. And so in that way, your data is split apart, it's combined with these, and then you get a composed profile. And I think that's important because underneath what both Dr. Abdillahi and Dr. Opara talked about is something that is out of view, which are your profiles, your data profiles. So all of this data that's taken up, as Dr. Abdillahi described, through digital watches, through these different algorithmic computational devices that are embedded and known to you and unknown, it then creates a composite. So it creates a composite out of recycling the past. This is why it is not artificial, because it is only taking the past. It can recombine it in hundreds of thousands of millions of different combinations, because computers can move that fast, and then claim to predict the future by only allowing the data from the past and to take any new data and reconfigure it in the prior frame of the past. So we have to ask ourselves, further to the question that Dr. Abdillahi said was, who does this benefit? Who does this prosper? And what is the motivation for this? Artificial intelligence is, again, to the second part of my statement, is not intelligent because it seeks to be able to organize information so that it becomes data, so it becomes predictable. Predictability means that now one can seek to find ways to monetize, to financialize the human, which brings us back to the very beginning of how we ended up in this current configuration on the screen in this moment, which takes us back to the transatlantic enslavement trade and the violent violation of the Americas and the transformation of the global economy. And so with artificial intelligence and the computation needed to run it, what we have is the ability to be pre-emancipation during the period in which the world had agreed and participated in the trafficking and abuse of children and women and men and non-binary folks. and we called that the transatlantic enslavement, and it was disgusting and it was vile and it continues to exist. We are in its afterlife, but what artificial intelligence does is allows us to remain, actually, let me correct that, allows us to go back to where we already came from, because at the end of the day, we have a corpus of 500 years. A corpus is how we speak about data in its rawest form, a corpus. It's also used in literature, corpa. And it's a massive 500-year trove of data that has been built and bred exclusively in the image of white supremacy. And we know that because we have hundreds of thousands of documents and we are here living in its afterlife. And so to understand that is to understand why we're obsessed in global markets with data, because it produces predictability. And enslaved people are predictable because they don't have choices to act otherwise. And so when we continue to gather this data, whether it's taken from us or it's voluntarily handed over, we create the fodder that is necessary for that predictability. And so that predictability allows one to say, well, this is a risk profile, to the beginning of your question, Jackie. So a risk profile is based on what is expected of you to do and what is actually happening and the difference between. So if the desired outcome is one which you're not attaining for whatever reason, whether it's your mental conduct or how you're presenting yourself, the risk is the assessment between. And so now having facial recognition software, back to the original questions, brings about a return to phrenology. And phrenology was a practice where they used to think they could use your skull to assess your criminality, your sexual orientation, but now it is still your skull, because what is being mapped in facial recognition, again, I'll describe what I'm doing. I'm pointing to key points of the face, which is your forehead, your occipital, your eye bone structure, your nose, the space between, and your jawbone, as well as the proximity between your neck, your chin, and your chest. These are key areas that are used by cameras to triangulate, which is why now, when you're wearing your face mask, if you do use that feature on your phone, it can still determine who you are with your face mask, because it's mapping your face and it's mapping your bone structure in your face. And so what that also means is that when we talk about artificial intelligence and mental health apps using expressions throughout the day, as we've seen in other research, it is then inferring what they believe that expression is based on what they knew in the past from a very specific frame. Because remember, how we express ourselves is bound to culture. In some cultures, we do one set of expressions and they communicate one thing. But the unfortunate thing with artificial intelligence is it compresses to make only one culture the central one. And that is, in the Americas, in the English-speaking world, it's that which exceeds and continues to leak out, which is white supremacy of Europe and the Americas. And so we need to remember, it is not artificial. It is produced from a 500-year corpora of white supremacist data. And as you heard from Dr. Ijeoma, the actual medical associations and societies upheld racial exclusion, upheld the idea that Black folks and women and differently abled people, not only inferior, but needed to be under the control of others. And so this is what is in hundreds of thousands of pages of peer-reviewed medical journals. And as many of us know, homosexuality was only decriminalized in the 1980s. And so everything in the corpus of literature before that speaks of being queer, trans, as being medically and clinically deficient and unwell. And so we have to understand and never set aside that the only thing artificial intelligence can work from is what has happened. And everything that it understands in the present moment is framed in that past. And that brings us very much to understand that when we think about what it's doing with mental health applications or in clinical care, it means that it's recycling some of the most violent periods that Black people and differently abled people and mad people have survived, while telling us that something can be different, but yet there is no difference in frame that can be entered, because as you learn from the picture of data versus information, that is pre-programmed. Without the ability to understand computation and control it, you can't manipulate that. So I'm going to finish up here by going back again to answering an earlier question, which is, and so what does that mean for race-based data? That means that when Black folks and others advocate for race-based data, someone like me can only believe they need support to understand the architecture of data, and that there is no such thing as Black. We don't put the words in BLAC. That's not what happens in coding. That's not what you're going to get. It's something you can't recognize, but what it does do is it connects it to every other thing that has ever been connected to Blackness. And we know, as I just pointed out, we have a 500-year history from 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th century of what to be Black, to be associated with African, to be associated with indigeneity has amounted to. And we know that because we have constitutions that have arisen. We have general compacts from the United Nations claiming as to what should be done about how we treat other beings and how we treat folks so that it is lawful and not violent. And so when we ask for race-based data, what we're actually asking for is to be connected to a past we never made ourselves, which we as sovereign and self-determined people had no control over what was documented and written. And we are reinscribing ourselves on that. And so who does it benefit? It benefits markets, because in Canada, we do have the research. Redlining happened here. That happened to my parents. We have articles about this. This is not an American phenomenon. This is a phenomenon of every racially constructed colony globally, from Australia to South Africa to Argentina. And so what we are in fact asking for is a solution that may have been well suited prior to 2007, prior to the internet, when we still had cabinets and papers and things just stayed one place. Race-based data was understood as an opportunity to answer the question of, how do we get justice? Why is it that when Black people try to access certain systems, negative outcomes? So how do we track that? And so what people were asking for, and we can look at it, and we can see what our elders have done in decades past to create a frame of relief and opportunity for Black people, was to seek justice. But instead of justice, we were told to collect race-based data. So rather than intervening in real time, we were encouraged to collect data about what's happening to Black people in COVID. And I always ask people, why do you need data? And they say, well, we need to know what's going on. And I said, well, you know what? If you're actually part of the conversation, if you're actually part of the community, you know what's going on. I know what's going on in Black communities because I am present, I am canvassing, I am doing appropriate types of engagement and relationship building. And so I know I don't need to sit far away somewhere with other people's information out of context and claim that that data can do something independent of the people for whom it belongs to. And so to put that all together, when we don't understand that race is not biological, and we are continually lulled into this idea and conflating that race is biological, then we attach race to a lot of things that are not biological and make inaccurate inferences and produce really poor clinical practice and medicine. And it just keeps getting worse and getting worse and getting worse. And so by offering up that data, either involuntarily, as Dr. Abdillahi talked about, passively through devices that you may purchase or subscribe to, or it's taken from you, what you're actually doing is augmenting, strengthening the actual infrastructure of racial dispossession and inequality. And I have to remind us all that if you want something to stop, you have to stop nurturing it. So if you want to stop the violence that is tied to race, you cannot continue to nurture it by giving it more and more data so it can create information that is inaccurate about who you really are and only about who you can be imagined to be through the transactions that produce wealth for the 1%. So I hope that ties together some strings in terms of data, information, race-based, and the deep concerns we should all have, and also suspicion about why many people don't understand the architecture and the value of data that is separate and apart from their lives or their control.
That was great. Thank you so much, Dr. James. I had a question based on that, but I don't know if the two of you would like to chime in first. And just a reminder, we have a little bit less than 10 minutes left.
Yeah, I wanted to, you know, I always love to be in the presence of Lana because she always gives a sermon on like 6 mounts. You know, you listen to her and then you go ahead and take an exam and you yourself become a PhD just off of one, you know, the dissertation that she offers. Lana, that was excellent and outstanding as always. And it got me thinking because, like I said, I have a grant. I'm a co-investigator on an NIH. NIH is the National Institute of Health, which is, you know, the government's research arm here in the States. And so we have a 2-day summit for all the research, the studies that have been done in my cohort. And so I was listening to a couple, and I referenced this in my talk, a couple of the presentations, but there was one that caught my ear, and it was looking at vitamin D. And there's a whole thing about vitamin D, which we don't have time to get into, but suffice it to say that the running narrative is that, you know, Black folks are inherently vitamin D deficient, that we have low vitamin D. This is, you know, dark-skinned individuals have low vitamin D. Again, there's a whole list of these stories that have been internalized and with barely any evidence. And that's not the sad part. Isn't that there's no evidence? The sad part is that nobody demands for evidence, right? Nobody questions it. We will question the hell out of, you know, well, how do you know that, you know, that medication does that thing, or that is the channel that receives that ligand, and, you know, but we will not. It is never questioned when it comes to race-based science, pseudoscience, which is essentially basura, is trash. And so the gentleman shared his study and kept saying that he was looking at vitamin D in African ancestry through the electronic health record. So it's like, and then European ancestry. So there's this sort of back and forth about ancestry, but your database, your sort of, you know, you're studying off of the electronic health record. How do you know what the ancestry is? And so that's one of the reasons, again, one of those key slides was race is not ancestry. Race is a socio-political construct created by white supremacism and racism in order to perpetuate and you know, economic and political power among those that racialized themselves as white. Okay. Ancestry, yeah, there's a real genetic ancestry that's more so tied to geography, you know, but in the Americas, because of the transatlantic slave trade, how do you make that determination of somebody's ancestry from skin color when 16% of African Americans have European alleles because of systematic and systemic rape, right? And the number of Black folks that passed as white because they could, even though their mom or grandmom, you know, was, you know, at the time a Negro. So the ways in which this is all conflated and wrapped nicely into a study and called science today, right? And so I'm reflecting on, Lana, on what you're talking about, the past, and how technology in all the various forms, reaches back into the past, reaches it into the present, disaggregates and reassembles to make a prediction of the future. I think about studies like this, and again, there's reflection to be had about, okay, who benefits from repeating and reiterating this tale that somehow people with quote unquote African ancestry in the United States. I mean, you can't. That sentence is nonsensical. How do you off of the electronic health record? That is where somebody, we don't know if it's the person or if it's somebody else that checked the US Census category of Black/African American. But what does that even mean? Right? And so when we have these studies that then inform technologies, because these results are going to be reported and they're going to go into and be collected by those that utilize them to create quote unquote solutions that are sold for profit. And how does these narratives get reiterated and re-emphasized? So I'm just sitting with that reflection, and I know we're at time, and grateful for the opportunity to have this very vital conversation and have it be reinforced that this needs to be ongoing in various spaces that we occupy, because things need to change fundamentally. And I'll end with this note, because the last thing you said, Lana, when we ask for race-based data, what are we asking for? And I think the other way that request is reframed is, well, we need to measure it. How do we measure? I think, and that's what is funded, and that is what you're invited to speak about, is to measure the impact. It sounds good, but what are we really saying? And so these are some pieces that I appreciated from what you offered.
Thank you so much. This conversation has been really amazing to witness. I'm really appreciative of you guys sharing all of your knowledge and expertise. And I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say that this was just really, really exciting to hear everything about your guys' knowledge on this topic. I have like 5 million other questions, but it is 8 o'clock. So I think we have to wrap it up. But I think we have one slide for the next series, right? So here it's on December 15th, again at the same time. There you can see on the screen here the 3 presenters that we'll be talking about. 4 presenters that will be talking about it, and this is the 4th session out of 5. The topic is transnational geographies, gendered violence in the movement of Black women and non-binary peoples. I don't know, Dr. Abdillahi, if you wanted to say anything else about this, or if there were any other closing statements that anyone wanted to make. I'm not sure if she's still here. Oh, here.
Yeah, I think just a couple of things. Yeah, I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Yes, it was just cutting out a little bit. I'm still here.
Can you hear me? Okay, is that better now? Can you hear me better?
It's a little glitchy for me, but I can hear you. I don't know for everybody else. It might be me though.
Yes, we can hear you, sis. A little glitchy, but we can hear you.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and try this now to the best of my ability. Hopefully you can hear me. So first of all, I'd just like to begin by thanking everybody. Let's go ahead and mute if you're not speaking. Let's go ahead and mute, family, if you're not speaking. Thank you very much. So I'd like to take a moment this evening to thank Dr. Ijeoma, Opara, Lana James, Jackie, Girgas, I'm going to say your name wrong, I'd also like to take a moment to thank the Access team, Luke, as well as Angie, who's our closed captioner. I'd also like to thank the research team, Apollo and Amber and Maddie, and Tali Chernovsky, who's also our Disability Publics Lab Coordinator at the School of Disability Studies at TMU. Please go ahead and check out our website at the school. We would love to hear from you, and we have amazing things happening. Going forward, again, this is the third of 5 sessions. So go ahead and welcome yourself to the 4th session, which will be happening on December 15th from 6 to 8 p.m., same time, same channel. We have a number of exciting speakers, as you can see on the screen here. Greatly looking forward to a cross-Atlantic conversation. And so we invite you to return then. And also, please go ahead and engage us online, on Twitter and on Instagram. Share your thoughts, share your comments and your learnings. Go ahead and tag us at Black Oculars. We hope to see all of you soon. Again, we apologize for any and all ASL issues today. We continue to work through it. And if you are attending and require any specialized or specific support to access today's discussion, go ahead and contact myself, Idil Abdillahi, at the TMU website, and or please feel free to contact Tali Chernyovsky as well, and we'll be happy to ensure that you have the most accessible process. So again, thank you all for being here. Thank you for taking the time to be with us on this Thursday, and kindly return on December 15th. Be well. It's Idil, and I'm done speaking.